Jews, after the fall of the Third Reich in 1945, were in a pretty bad condition. Then how did they manage to create the modern day nation of Israel and get all this support from the United States? What did the US gain from it? So you see, the Jews, the Jewish diaspora has been present in Europe for about 2000 years. Uh, and they lived in various parts of Europe, and they were persecuted from time to time. There was tremendous anti-Semitism that was, done against them. They also did well in various parts of Europe, and they became pretty wealthy. They became pretty influential. They were money lenders. They were merchants. They were wealthy. They would even lend money to kings to finance their various military and other campaigns. So Jews fared much better than the Romani people in Europe. The Romani people were subjected to all kinds of horrific atrocities. The Jews fared better. They also had to face massacres. They also had to face all kinds of horrible accusations. They also had to face pogroms, the Jews in various parts of Europe from time to time. But they also were able to be successful in Europe. Now, a lot of Jews migrated to the United States in the 19th century. And a significant portion of the Jews that migrated to the US in the 19th century, they settled down on the East Coast. A lot of them settled down in New York City. More than 30% of the population of New York City was Jewish. Let's fact check what I'm just saying here. I should not. Yeah, let's fact check that. What percentage of NYC population was Jewish in 1880? Let's see. Over 6.6%. Really? What about 1800? Do we have figures? Less than 1%. What about 1900? 70 to 20. 1900, 17 to 20% of the city's total population. What about 1930? So you can see there's a big influx of Jewish people. So by 1930, the Jewish population in New York City was about 30%. Okay. So there were a lot of wealthy Jewish people. So they didn't, when they came to the US, many of them were poor. They had escaped Germany, they had escaped various parts of Europe, and they wanted to settle down in this new country and start a new life. And they were pretty industrious. They took initiative and they became successful. Some of them came with some money. So eventually by 1930 or something, about 30% of the population of New York City is Jewish, and many of them are really, really wealthy. So that's one thing we have to understand. That, yeah, Jews were in terrible condition in Europe after the fall of the Third Reich and during the Second World War because of what the Nazis did to them, what Hitler's Nazis did to the Jews, no question. But in the United States, Jews were increasingly wealthy. Okay? Now, there was in the 19th century the beginning of the Zionist movement, the movement for a nation of the Jewish people. There was this journalist, an Austro-Hungarian journalist called Theodor Herzl, who, because of rising anti-Semitism and other issues, he essentially gave Zionism a clear political program. He said that Jews needed a state of their own. Jews were a nation in their own right, and they needed a physical, geographical state or nation of their own. And the first Zionist Congress happened in Basel in 1897, in which this guy, he published a pamphlet arguing for the creation of a Jewish nation. He said that he and his allies, they said that their goal was to create a Jewish nation in what was then called Ottoman Palestine, right? And they built this international organization, Zionist organization, to pursue this objective diplomatically through settlement of Jews. So during the First World War, okay, the First World War is the 1910s. During this time, the British captured the region of Palestine, it was then called Palestine, from the Ottoman Empire. And Britain then began to see Zionism as something that was in alignment with British strategic interests in the region. So in 1917, the British government issued something called the Balfour Declaration. It said that it was in favor of the establishment of a Jewish nation in this region called Palestine, and they said that they would not do anything that would be bad for the people who already live there, the Arab people who already live there, right? So that was the Balfour Declaration, and after the First World War ended, Turkey was carved up, and the League of Nations, which was the precursor of the United Nations, it gave Britain the mandate of Palestine. So Britain would manage and administer and rule Palestine. And that's when Jewish immigration starts in the region. In the 1920s, 30s, 1940s, there are multiple waves, successive waves of Jewish immigrants coming into what was then called Palestine and settling over there, right? And why were they settling over there? Because there was this rise of anti-Semitism in Europe, eventually because of the Nazi, atrocities against Jews, the Holocaust, right? So the Jews would then settle in Palestine. They would purchase land. They would create agricultural colonies. They even created militias, armies, and political parties, all of that. And they created eventually a separate Jewish society alongside the Arab majority at the time in what was then called Palestine. And this began to spark violence, resentment from the locals. And this began to start violence between the Arabs and the Jews. Okay. So then the Second World War ends. And in a couple of years later, the UN General Assembly, it said that Palestine should be partitioned into two separate nations, a Jewish nation and an Arab nation. And Jerusalem would be under international administration. So the Jewish leaders, the Zionist leaders, they accepted this plan, but the Arab leaders were unhappy with it. They said it is unjust and they rejected it. So after the vote for the partition, fighting broke out between the Arabs and the Jews in Palestine. And once the British withdrew by 1948, this escalated into a full-scale war. So the state of Israel was declared or proclaimed in 1948, and immediately once this happens, all the Arab nations, they attack Israel, and that is the 1948 Arab-Israel War. And Israel gets support from its allies, and there is a ceasefire armistice in 1949. And by the time the ceasefire happens, the nation of Israel controls about 80% of the former mandate of Palestine, the British mandate of Palestine, much more than the area that was given to it by the United Nations. And it is said that several 100,000 Palestinians were expelled, or they had fled from the territory. So that essentially is how the nation of Israel was formed. And even though Jews had to face terrible circumstances in Europe because of the Holocaust, because of the policies of the Third Reich, the Jews in the United States were very wealthy, and they were able to support the Jews who needed help. And eventually, because of US support, Israel was able to survive. And that is the story. What does the US gain from it? The US gains an ally in the Middle East, right? See, the Middle East is a very important region geopolitically from the perspective of energy security, because much of the world's oil, petroleum comes from this region. And it makes sense for the US to have a very strong ally in the region, right? And a powerful ally in the region. So it makes sense for the US.